begin to write Viral?
When did we begin to write it? Around the beginning of 2021, around the end of 2020, beginning of 21. So we finished it in September with a little bit of editing through till October, November, and it was published very soon after that. So it was an incredibly short turnaround for a book by normal standards. So yeah, sometime in the winter of 2021 was when we began writing the book.
And this is after lockdown, or when it was all coming?
Well, no, it's in the middle of a series of lockdowns. So in the UK, of course, we had the first lockdown in March through to June, and then we had the second lockdown in the autumn of that year, and then there was another lockdown in 2021, wasn't there? When was that? In the spring of 2021, I think. But
it's all a blur now.
It's a blur, isn't it? And then the most fascinating one of all for me is the failure to lock down in December 2021, when the experts insisted vociferously, S.A.G.O particularly demanded that the government lock down again because of the Omicron wave, and refused to countenance the evidence that was already accumulating from South Africa and elsewhere that Omicron was much milder, and not just because a lot of people were vaccinated, it was inherently milder, and made forecasts, official forecasts, that there would be around 6,000 deaths per day by mid-January if the Johnson government refused to lock down in December 21. And they called their bluff. The Johnson government refused to lock down, and deaths did rise in January 22, but only to 200 a day at the maximum. So, 1/30th of what was forecast.
Yeah. And these were specifically from COVID or from?
Yeah, well, these were COVID scored deaths. And
right.
Yeah, that was hardly likely to be an underestimate, given that if you had COVID when you had a car crash, you were said to have died of COVID.
COVID, yeah. So the reason I wanted to talk to you is it's my perception still that the lab leak hypothesis is, in quotes, a right-wing conspiracy, a conspiracy theory generally. And it's not really people's fault, because the mainstream media did put out that narrative, didn't they? Certainly at the beginning, when people were beginning to question.
Yep.
But the authorities have kind of changed their tune now, but the mainstream media haven't put those corrections out there in any sense, have they?
Correct. That's the frustration right now, because people come up to me all the time and say, you must feel vindicated. Everybody now agrees it was a lab leak. And I say, well, that's true of the public, but it isn't true of the elite. It isn't true of most government officials. Even though the official position of the US government and the UK government is, yes, a lab leak is a possibility.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not true of the scientific establishment. It has never been stated by the Royal Society, the National Academy in the US, by Nature magazine, by Science magazine, any of these great and good of science, that a lab leak is highly plausible or even possible. They do everything they can to rush through into publication any article or paper that seems to dent the idea of a lab leak, and refuse to publish anything that supports the idea of a lab leak. The BBC does exactly the same. And yet, if you say to them, is a lab leak possible? They'll say, yes, but we don't think it's very likely. And so there's a real double standard here. Either this is a serious possibility and it ought to be investigated by proper journalists, by proper intelligence agents, by proper scientists, and they ought to take it seriously and, encourage debates about it for a start. And I've banged my head against many a brick wall trying to get some of these organizations to have a debate about this unbelievably important issue, the greatest man-made industrial disaster in history, if it was a lab leak. And they are basically behaving as if reports that people dying of radiation in Chernobyl or dying of chemical poisoning in Bhopal are probably not to be trusted. I'm sorry, but in those instances, a few hundreds, a few thousands died. In this case, we're talking about millions dying. 20 million at least, probably 28 is one of the estimates I've seen. So the bizarre position whereby the great and the good somehow cling to the raft of lab leak being a nutty conspiracy theory only pursued by right-wing people and things like that, while not quite, going as far as to say they could definitely rule it out, of course. Push comes to shove, they say, oh, yes, I've still got an open mind, but they haven't, is a very frustrating experience. And it's one that I've never seen before. Imagine if there's a 10% chance that this thing happened as a result of an accident in a laboratory and killed 28 million people. The world should be all over that, should be saying, look, a 10% chance of having killed 28 million people is something we've got to take very seriously and investigate properly. And they won't do that. Now, why is that? We can get on to discussing that.
Okay, yeah. So then there is no investigation still into this.
Well, this is the joke, isn't it? I used to ask the UK, when I was still in the House of Lords, I used to ask the UK government from time to time, what are we doing as the UK to investigate the possibility that this was a lab leak or how the pandemic began? And I always got the answer, we're leaving it to the WHO. Now, the WHO had two goes at answering this question. First of all, in February 2020, right at the start, they did send a delegation to China.
This is the Potemkin hospital issue?
No, that's later. That's the
right. This is the
second one.
Okay, the Potemkin labs. Yeah.
Yes. Well, they sent a delegation which basically fawned all over Xi Jinping and said, terribly sorry, you're doing a marvelous job of looking after this. And we quite agree it's a terrible natural thing. They realized that wasn't good enough. And they came under pressure to mount a proper investigation. And they took 4 months to get the membership of their investigating team agreed by the Chinese government. And the only US member on that team was Peter Daszak, the head of the EcoHealth Alliance, which had worked very closely with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And that group went to Wuhan for about 2 weeks in February 21, sorry. Yeah, February 21. Yep, sorry. It's difficult to keep the dates straight. And were shown around as if they were tourists. They had to spend 10 days in their hotel room to start with for isolation. Then they were shown some sites, including the museum dedicated to the defeat of COVID. They were allowed 4 hours at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They were at the wrong campus, the one where the experiments on these viruses were not done. They were at the new campus, not the old campus. They were shown the biosafety level 4 laboratory, which is a red herring. It's not where any of these experiments were done, and so on. And they refused to even ask to see the database that the lab has of all its viruses. And when asked why they didn't ask for this, Peter Daszak said, it's because I know what's in the database. So when people like me then say to him, okay, so what is in it? He says, I'm not telling you. Or rather, in fact, he doesn't know. So it was the most extraordinary and pathetic farce of an investigation. And it ended up, if you remember, in February the 9th, 2021, with a press conference at which the team and its Chinese counterparts announced that a lab leak was very unlikely, extremely unlikely was the words they used, and that much more likely was that it arrived in Wuhan on frozen food from abroad.
Oh, yes, the popsicle hypothesis.
The popsicle hypothesis, exactly. For which there has never been even a smidgen of evidence. And this was to placate the Chinese. Now, that press conference did backfire. It was so farcical, so foolish, that the head of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, had to put out a statement saying, despite that, we are still taking the lab leaks theory seriously, and we're going to set up a thing called S.A.G.O, the Scientific Advisory Group on, I can't remember what the next bit of the acronym stands for, but
I'll find
organisms or something. Yeah, anyway. And
Puddings.
that group has been meeting ever since, allegedly, but we've never seen the slightest hint of any decent work being done by them. I mean, it's a genuine joke. You know, they've set up a committee so that governments like the British government can say to people like me, oh, we're leaving it to the WHO. They've set up S.A.G.O. And S.A.G.O is stuffed with people who don't think it was a lab leak and don't want to find out whether it might have been, and are quite prepared to occasionally have a meeting in which they read the minutes of the previous meeting. Now, I may be being unfair. Maybe behind the scenes there is terrific Hercule Poirot-like investigative dynamism going on. But it's 3 years now they set that committee up, and nothing has come out of it of any significance at all.
Well, we're kind of skipping over the whole drama of what you get to in the book, which really starts in the noughties, where they began the gain of function experiments. And then there was a moratorium, or that was actually much later. But then they found in China, the copper mine. The copper mine, basically.
Well, to give you, I'll try and do the sort of 30-second version of 20 years of history. 2001 anthrax attacks. The result of that is that the Bush administration sets up a semi-secret, protected from congressional investigation, stream of funding, huge stream of funding to do bioterrorism defense, puts Anthony Fauci in charge of it. That creates a lot of clients, because when you pour a lot of money into something, a lot of people cluster around to get their hands on that money. And one of the organizations that gets its hand on the money is the EcoHealth Alliance, this little wildlife charity that's changed itself into a sort of virus hunting charity. And he directs the hypothesis that the way to prevent the next pandemic is to go and find the viruses in bats, in caves, in Western China.
After SARS.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Well, particularly after SARS, they focus on bat viruses, you're right. Bring them to a lab and do experiments on them. Now, this is, looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. And the latest data, by the way, there's a very good paper come out very recently saying, these viruses live in the guts of bats. That's a safe place to leave them, right? Yeah. They want to be in the guts of bats. They're not infectious to human beings. But there is this one weird incident in 2012, in April 2012, in a place called Mojiang in southwest China, in Yunnan, a very long way from Wuhan, by the way, over 1,000 miles away.
Isn't it near the Lao border?
It's near the Lao border. Yeah. And this is where, because the price of copper had shot up, a bunch of people decided to reopen an old copper mine. And the first thing they had to do was shovel out all the bat guano that had accumulated in one of the shafts. In doing so, they inhaled a huge amount of bat guano. Now, as I said, these viruses live in the guts of bats, so the bat guano
is be in their feces. Yeah,
bat droppings are full of viruses, and 4 of them got very sick. And everybody, they were taken very seriously. It was taken to Kunming, which is a long way away, to the best hospital in the region. From all over China, virologists came to try and work out what was going on, and they thought they had caught. They were seeing human beings catching SARS for the first time, or a SARS cousin. And so one of the things they did was commission a team from Wuhan to go all the way down there and collect samples from the bats in the mine shaft. And they found 9 viruses that 10 years later turned out to be the closest living relatives of SARS-CoV-2. Yeah. They took it back to the lab, and in 2018, the year before the pandemic, they defrosted one of these samples and started sequencing the genome of the virus that they could find in that bat guano.
And at the time, they started also working with the teams that were putting furin cleavage sites, basically, which allows a gain of function into viruses. So these 2 elements came together then.
Exactly.
This virus from the copper mine and the technology of the.
That's right. So Ben Hu and his colleagues in Xi Zhengli's lab in Wuhan began doing a series of experiments to emulate and rival the rather brilliant work that had been done by Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, in which he had worked out how to grow coronaviruses in the lab and then manipulate them, then take out one of their genes and put in another one, or put in a particular sequence into a particular part of the genome. And one of the experiments they planned to do in a document that is dated 2018 was to insert a furin cleavage site into a SARS-like beta coronavirus for the very first time on planet Earth. Now, we found at least 800 kinds of SARS-CoV virus. Since then, none of them has a furin cleavage site except SARS-CoV-2. And this experiment had been done by some of these scientists on some other viruses already, putting furin cleavage sites into SARS-like, into other viruses, had already been done on a number of, half a dozen occasions already, including at least 2 experiments in Wuhan and one with a MERS-like virus, which is a cousin. They wanted to do it. They said they were going to do it. They were turned down by the American Department of Defense to fund it, but they met again shortly afterwards, the very same team, to discuss, as far as we can tell, how to fund it in another way. And the Chinese Academy of Sciences put a new grant into the lab around this time, which was probably for this work. So it's very, very odd that we go 4 billion years without a furin cleavage site in a SARS-CoV virus, and then one turns up a year after a proposal is made to put one in a SARS-CoV virus, and in the very same city where they proposed to do much of the work.
Yeah.
Now, that is, I mean, just on probability alone, it means you've got to take this seriously as a possibility.
Yeah. Well, I mean, parsimoniously, yes,
Exactly.
you do. I mean, you would say the null hypothesis would be that it is a natural spread. But when
I'm not sure I agree with that, actually, because I think 20 years ago, you would say your null hypothesis must be that it's zoonoses, because nearly all outbreaks are natural zoonoses. But nearly all natural outbreaks happened before we started manipulating viruses in labs.
Yeah.
And once we started doing that, your null hypothesis goes out the window. It becomes...
No, I agree. I was going to say, but
yes.
because of the coincidence, and actually just where the labs are, where the supposed outbreak started, which probably didn't start in the wet market at all, but the person who was what you call kind of patient 0 or whatever actually went to the market and spread.
It may not even have been patient 0. It may have been patient 10 who went to the market.
Yeah, because people were getting ill, weren't they, in Wuhan before then? But didn't the Chinese government destroy those medical records of those first?
That's true. The Chinese government ordered the destruction of a lot of the medical samples.
And some of them were people who worked in the lab, weren't they?
Well, we don't know that.
Okay.
At least I don't think we know that. We know from US intelligence, which is very confident, that there were 3 members of that lab, including Ben Hu and Ping Yuping, who were both highly relevant people working exactly in this area, who got sick enough to go to hospital that autumn with symptoms that sound awfully like COVID. Now, Ben Hu has gone public saying, no, I didn't have COVID. He would say that, wouldn't he? As Mandy Miles Davis once said.
Did he have to sign in blood saying that?
Well, this is the frustrating thing, and there's another angle on this that I think needs to be taken into account. I've been trying to make this case more recently, and that is that there was something very odd about this virus from the start. It was highly infectious. It didn't need to do much mutating to get very good at spreading between people. I mean, it was ready to go out of the box. It was from the get-go, it was highly infectious. Now, that's highly unusual with zoonoses.
Yeah.
Normally what you see is somebody gets a nasty bug that's often very virulent, it can kill them, but it's not very good at passing on to another person. And so it's quite easy to stop the spread. So that's why Nipah and Hendra and Marburg and Ebola and all these other animal diseases that make occasional jumps into people, and Ebola does it, every few years there's an outbreak, and it spreads a little bit, and you've got to take precautions, but it's not wildly infectious.
It might have been the case
wildly infectious, it's got to have learned how to deal with this host.
Does it have to evolve its own furin cleavage site, or does it? Because I'm just thinking that from the miners who clearly got infected,
but didn't infect anyone else.
Yeah, didn't infect anybody else. It was probably a pathogen load.
That's right. So there's there's likely to be a dose effect. If you get a huge dose of a bat virus, it can probably infect you and kill you. If you get but what it can't do is infect the next person who gets a smaller dose. You know, the nurse who happens to pick up an aerosol droplet when she's treating you in the hospital or whatever.
Because it hasn't gone through that process of that selection.
Right. And this isn't necessarily furin. There are other ways in which the virus is adapting, particularly to binding effectively to the ACE2 receptor on human cells. This virus loves human ACE2s.
Well, and they were doing
ACE2s.
Yeah, they were doing these experiments on humanized mice.
Well, this is why another document is incredibly important, apart from the diffuse document, which says that they were going to do the furin cleavage site. There's another document which broke in the middle of 2021, which is, and it may have even been 22 before we first saw it, actually, which is a very belated report from the EcoHealth Alliance to the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease on the work that it's been funding in China. And this document contains a graph which shows the results of a series of experiments, not with SARS-CoV-2 or anything very close to it, but with a different kind of SARS-like virus. But what they've done in this case is they've swapped the spike gene from one virus into the backbone of another virus and infected humanized mice and human cells.
Human cells which mimic the lung specifically.
The human airway epithelial cells, yes. Cultured cells from human lungs. You know, I mean, this is just so crazy. It really makes my head boil. But anyway, the point is, in those experiments, they found that by swapping the spike gene, they could sometimes increase the infectivity by 10,000-fold. So that, you know, that is what we call gain of function. I mean, that's the very definition of gain of function. I mean, I co-wrote with two other authors a scientific paper about all this and submitted it to a journal which had actually asked us to submit this paper from the Royal Society in Britain. And it was rejected out of hand without being sent to any referees because the editor said, there is no evidence of gain of function experiments in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, you can say a lot of things about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but you cannot say that. You know, there it is in black and white, the experiments they did. I mean, they published some of them in Nature saying, we have enhanced the ability of this virus to infect human cells. How is that not gain of function? Sorry, I'm not worked up about this, but it really is very frustrating dealing with people. And many scientists say, oh, you must be wrong because of X. And you say,
these are Western scientists, not Chinese.
Western scientists, exactly. And you know, many of them are definitely up to their ears in Chinese funding, Chinese collaborations, Chinese influence of various kinds, and they don't want to rock that boat.
Exactly. I want to kind of get to that at some point when we about thinking.
But that's not the only reason. There's also you know, there is a tribal cultural immune reaction here going on, where a group of people say, whatever happens, we don't care who gets blamed for this pandemic, as long as they're some Chinese peasant selling animals in a market. It just mustn't be any nice middle-class scientists who get blamed. You see what I mean? There's a really nasty class element to this, I think. And, you know, we've been accused of being racist by saying, you know, how dare you suspect Chinese scientists of not doing their experiments properly? Well, I can't think of anything more racist than saying, oh, it's because the Chinese have disgusting eating habits and go to funny markets and buy animals, you know. So I'm sorry, if we're going to start throwing racism accusations around, which I'm not, then it's the pot calling the kettle black.
But everything seems to boil down to these kinds of ad hominem things today, don't they?
Well, we live in a polarized world where social media and echo chambers make everybody feel tremendously justified in their own position and tremendously critical of everyone else's. And of course, I'm subject to that too. But I would add that I have zero vested interest in this.
No.
It wasted 4 years of my life. I wrote a book that wasn't at all profitable for me. Not only did I share the authorship, therefore giving away half the proceeds, I wasn't paid nearly as much for it as I was for my previous book. And I then gave away half the proceeds to charity because Alina and I thought that was the right thing to do in this case so that we couldn't be seen. I'm not bothered about that. That's not why I did it. But the point is, there's nobody with a vested interest in proving this is a lab leak. Literally, I can't think of anyone whose pay is going to go up if it proves to be a lab leak. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah.
a lot of people whose pay depends upon keeping the lab leak theory out of circulation.
The initial paper was it Nature, the proximal origins paper?
It was Nature Medicine,
Nature Medicine.
One of Nature's journals.
Has that been redacted? Retracted?
Should have been. It's a shocking paper, and to my shame, I believed it at the time. I did not think this was a lab leak at the start. I looked into it. I thought it didn't sound very likely, and then I read this paper in Nature Medicine, which came out in March 2020, saying it is highly implausible that it's anything to do with a lab leak, and here are some reasons. And I didn't fully follow the reasons. I didn't read it terribly carefully, but I thought, well, these virologists must know what they're talking about. The reasons turned out to be completely wrong and spurious. So, for example, they said the furin cleavage type means nothing because we're going to find one in other viruses. Well, 800 other viruses later of the same kind, and we still haven't found one, right? So that argument is wrong. They said if you were going to do a genetic manipulation, you wouldn't do it this way. Well, why not? That's exactly the way they have been doing it in other similar viruses in the past. They said if you were going to do it, you would make it a more efficient furin cleavage site. It's pretty damned efficient. It's capable of spreading like wildfire and being almost impossible to stop with lockdowns. I mean, how is that not a good enough? It may not be perfect, but it's good enough, et cetera, et cetera. So these were really weird, spurious reasons in that paper. They don't stand a moment's inspection. But worse, the 5 authors of that paper all communicated with each other on the Slack channel during a key meeting and afterwards while they were drafting the paper. And throughout that period, they kept saying, all 5 of them are on the record as saying something to the effect of, well, I still think a lab leak actually is quite likely. And they said that even after the paper was published. So it's not that they changed. They're now saying, oh, yes, we thought that to start with, but then we changed our minds when we saw new evidence.
There are 2 hidden authors of that paper, though, aren't there?
That's right. So we now know from Freedom of Information emails that Jeremy Farrar and Anthony Fauci were both involved in helping to draft that paper, to commission it and draft it. And the rules say that you cannot publish a paper in a journal like Nature Medicine and leave authors off if they've made a significant contribution. We need to know who's contributing to these papers. So on those grounds alone, the paper deserves to be retracted or corrected. In any other field, that paper is so scandalously shown to be fraudulent that it would have been retracted. But if they were to retract it now, it would be such a humiliation for the scientific community and such a triumph for the lab leakers that they can't countenance it. And the journal editor at Nature Medicine has had petitions delivered to him by serious tenured professors, friends of mine working on this, saying, please retract this paper. And he won't even acknowledge that he's received these petitions. Now, that's disgraceful. Where is Retraction Watch? Where are these other organizations that are supposed to police ethics in science? It's gone out the window.
Everyone's bought, aren't they?
Yeah, well, you can tell from this that I have gone from being a respectable member of the pro-science establishment, a member of the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee, to being a furious sans-culotte radical who wants to blow the whole system up because I think it's corrupt. Now, I'm exaggerating. Of course, I haven't gone that far, and of course, I believe in a lot of science. But the damage this has done to the reputation of science in my eyes and many other people's eyes is colossal.
And paradoxically, they did it, or they wanted to suppress the lab leak hypothesis to protect science. Is that right?
Well, that is the question. Have they done more harm or more good to science by the actions they've taken? And I am strongly of the view that they've done more harm than good. If they had said early in 2020, we don't know how this virus originated, we need to investigate, we don't think it's a lab leak, but we're going to look into that possibility in an open-minded way, and we'll welcome any scientists. We're going to give grants to scientists to look into this with us. Then I think when it emerged that it probably was a lab leak, the damage would be confined to one small corner of virology, and we would be having a reasonable debate about why gain-of-function research of concern of a particular kind on potential pandemic pathogens, which is probably 1% of virology, let alone 1%, 0.001% of science, whether that should be more carefully regulated. As it is, we've now got people like me and many others saying, I'm not sure anything in science can be trusted anymore if people behave like this.
No, yeah. I mean, it's hard to differentiate between the Chinese government and the free West, really, in the degree that they are both kind of in cahoots.
As I said, it's worth imagining if this had happened in Brazil or India or France. Do we really think we would have allowed the government of that country to completely stonewall, to refuse to release any of the data from the lab, to manipulate and curate anything that gets out, to go on social media and insult people who are trying to investigate? Because that's, I've had Chinese spokesmen digging up through my history to try and find things to embarrass me about, these are government agents, these aren't just sort of random trolls. In any other country, we would have insisted, the World Health Organization would have insisted, and the government of that country would eventually have said, yeah, no, look, we do need to look into this. I completely agree. Here's the lab notebooks, here's the database. Come and have a really good look around, and let's try and nail this one way or the other.
Open the books
but for some reason, China is too powerful for us to be allowed to do that. Now, that's really scary, I think.
Yeah. So what?
Sorry, by the way, links to something that came up in Prime Minister's questions today when Rishi Sunak made the point to Keir Starmer that refusing to enact the free speech legislation about universities is almost certainly, it looks like it's a policy that's been lent on by Chinese interests, saying, hang on, we don't like what you're doing in trying to give universities a duty of free speech.
Really? In the UK?
Yeah. Well, there is
and Starmer is.
There is I'll need to find the details of this, and perhaps you better be careful about which bits of this you broadcast until we know. But if you watch Prime Minister's questions today, Rishi Sunak links the relationship with China with the free speech in universities question. Okay. And I've seen other reporting that makes the same link, that the reason why Bridget Phillipson, as Education Secretary, decided not to enact the already passed legislation that requires universities to uphold free speech and allow anything to be said, that one of the reasons for that was pressure from Chinese lobbyists. Now, that might or might not be true, but it's an indication of just how far we've gone in our university sector in allowing Chinese influence to have a very strong impact.
Well, there's some question about why they were doing this research in the first place. Because they're mixed use labs, which means that they can be used for looking for for viruses to create vaccines, or they can also have a dual military use, which could be a bio defense. I think they call it defense now rather than bioweapons. Bioweapons are now biodefense.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, lots of governments around the world have bioweapons research. They all say it's defensive. We want to know how to combat an enemy that uses a bioweapon against us. And mostly I believe them. And one of the genesis of one of the sources of this research in China is actually a program begun to head off the possibility of a bioterrorist attack on the Beijing Olympics. So, I think it's absolutely true that a lot of the motive driving this work is to say, let's do some quite scary experiments on quite dangerous organisms so that we can understand, predict, and combat attacks on us, either by conventional enemies or by terrorists. And that's fair enough. That's a good reason for doing it. But of course, it is itself dangerous. That doesn't make it safe just because the motive is good. In fact, that isn't the stated motive of this research. The stated motive of this research was to predict and prevent pandemics. They were very clear about that. The EcoHealth Alliance said that over and over again. The Wuhan Institute of Virology said it over and over again. If you let us go and find viruses in the wild, we will be able to work out which ones are close to causing human pandemics next. And we will do that by doing experiments in labs as well as by harvesting viruses in the wild. Now, that was never a very persuasive case. And some of the very virologists who are currently most active in trying to squash the lab leak were themselves very critical about 5 years before the pandemic, of that excuse, of the Global Virome Project, as it was called, and the PREDICT program, and these other hugely well remunerated virus hunting projects. They said, this isn't the way to find the next pandemic. There's billions of viruses out there. You're looking for a needle in a haystack. Even when you found it, it's not clear that bringing it to a lab is anything other than a stupid thing to do. These guys were saying that.
A lab in the city, especially.
And by the way, the World Health Organization and other organizations were saying up until 2019, regularly saying, one of the ways a next pandemic might start is through a lab accident. Now they don't say it anymore. No. It was a document put out just today, actually, which suddenly looks very different from the previous version of the document because it doesn't mention the possibility of lab leak. So the very moment when we've had a lab leak is the moment when they want to say they want to stop talking about it.
There have been leaks before, just not one that's created a pandemic. Is that
well? Even
right?
That's not quite true. There's been many, many thousands of laboratory accidents that have led to infections. Lots of really relevant ones. For example, SARS itself, after the SARS outbreak was over, was still being studied in labs, and it caused at least 6 infections, including one in Beijing where 11 people caught it, and it very nearly started another epidemic. And in 5 of those 6 cases, we don't actually know how the lab leak happened. So the researcher in question got infected, but didn't drop a test tube or something. But there was a global pandemic caused by a laboratory accident. It was in 1977. It wasn't a very serious one because it was just a not very bad version of flu, but it was an influenza virus that they were making a vaccine out of in northern China. And it was a strain that was extinct in the wild and had been for nearly 20 years. So for it to suddenly emerge and go global was very puzzling. Where's it been? Frozen in the ice? Its genome was identical to the 20-year-old one. And the answer eventually emerged that it was almost certainly because they'd got that old strain out of the freezer, as it were, and tried to make a vaccine out of it, and they hadn't killed the vaccine properly, and the vaccine itself was infectious and caused a global pandemic. And it went around the world. I may well have got it, you may well have got it, but it wasn't a very serious flu, and so it's just one of many influenza epidemics. But it does show that these things happen all the time.
Yeah.
And, the other example I like to cite is the 2007 foot and mouth outbreak in Surrey, not the big one in 2001, but the small one in 2007, where one farm got infected. That farm was 13 miles from the world's leading foot and mouth virus reference laboratory at a place called Pirbright. Did we say, oh, that's probably just a coincidence? No, we did not. We went to the farm and we went to the lab and we said, have you had any work done on the farm?
Yeah,
We said, yeah,
that's the null hypothesis, isn't it? It's kind of
exactly.
if a virus breaks out next door to a lab that studies viruses and creates viruses and does gain of function work on viruses, that's your null hypothesis. It's not going to be coming from a cave.
It changes your Bayesian priors.
Sorry?
It changes the Bayesian priors.
Yeah, definitely. I got piqued just simply because of the fact that you weren't allowed to even talk about it. So
Facebook banned all mention of the lab leak for many months, well into 2021. The New York Times, the BBC dismissed it as a nutty conspiracy theory. They like to say now that it was because Donald Trump was irresponsibly talking about it. You know what? That's not even true. He didn't mention the possibility of it having come out of a Chinese laboratory until April 2020. Now, they'd already published Proximal Origin a month before that. So actually, they were preemptively, if they thought, oh my God, we mustn't talk about this in case Donald Trump talks about it. Well, that's one thing, but that's not the same as saying we're trying to shoot it down because Donald Trump's talking about it, because he wasn't.
No, it's just that Trump is a trigger word, isn't it? People have been primed once they hear Trump to immediately go on the defensive.
Exactly that.
So yeah, what are we going? I mean, the media, they're already suffering. Nobody trusts the media anymore. Politicians, if it is mostly linked to money, to funding, how do we break it? I mean, is academia just lost? Is it lost?
No, there are lots of fabulous academics doing fabulous work and being.
Where are they getting their money from?
Honest about it. But if you read the scientific literature on any subject compared with 20 years ago, you find much less in the way of curiosity-driven papers and much more in the way of sort of politically inspired research, looking at something with a view to proving something that could be used politically. Whether it's on diet or climate or medicines, or there's a real sort of normative feel to most papers now, which there wasn't 20 years ago. And that worries me, because I do think that science, actually, in some ways, there's nothing new about this. Science being dogmatic and subject to groupthink and getting completely obsessed with wrong hypotheses is as old as, phlogiston and all those kind of things. It's been going on for hundreds of years. And scientists are prone to confirmation bias in the same way that any human being is. I look for evidence that supports my view. I don't go and look for evidence that might shoot down my view. But what kept science honest at its best was the fact that it was fragmented and decentralized. So Professor A stood up and said Professor B was talking bunk and he was a blithering idiot and he ought to be shot and whatever. Maybe not the latter, but you get the point. And then they had a good argument and we decided whether A was right or B was right. Now you get these monolithic funding streams where you get all your money from one agency of the US government or one Wellcome Trust or one UK government and Wellcome Trust working together, because they never do anything to challenge each other, actually. And so all the money in Alzheimer's goes to the amyloid plaque hypothesis and not to alternative hypotheses.
It's a massive scandal, really, isn't it?
And it tends, and you saw, for example, with the, ulcer research with atheroma and heart disease and cholesterol, that science gets stuck in false hypotheses and behaves like a Catholic Church saying, no, we're not going to publish your paper because you're not part of the dogma. You're a heretic. And actually, heretics are what makes science work. All great scientists start as heretics. That doesn't mean all heretics are right. Of course not.
Oh.
but it does mean that you have to take some of them seriously.
But the mechanism of skepticism has been lost.
Well, it's not been entirely lost, but it's in trouble compared with 20 years ago, yes.
Right. Okay. Let's get back to that idea about free speech, because none of this would have been possible, would have been found out were it not for, you call them internet sleuths.
This is a terribly important point, and it's one that I feel very strongly about because there's a tendency for it to get lost now. The people who made the running in finding out really important information about what was going on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology were not journalists, were not scientists, were not politicians, were not intelligence agents. They were random people living with their mums in Bhubaneswar and Madrid. I'm thinking of two specific examples there, two of the most admirable people, who did things like find out how to get hold of a password to get into a Chinese website where academic theses were lodged. That's what the S.A.G.O did from India.
Mm-hmm.
Or in the case of Francisco Ribera in Madrid, go through every possible last detail of a paper about viruses and of a deposition in a genetic database, because from those bits of information you could piece together what the serial number of the virus meant in terms of when it had been collected and where it had been collected. And so, for example, Francisco worked out that they had collected 1,320 viral samples altogether from the Mojiang mine, only 9 of which were S.A.G.O viruses, these are popsicle viruses. It was only after he'd worked that out that Xi Zhengli and co were forced into publishing a paper to confirm that they had found 9 and not 1 virus in this mine, because Francisco had pointed out they'd found 9, not 1. And so they were forced to add an addendum to their Nature paper saying, yeah, we did find another 8 out of 1,322. So he was out by 2. Now, Francisco is trained as an auditor of companies. Okay, he likes to go through people's accounts and see where somebody's cheating the firm or the firm is cheating its customers or whatever. So missing invoices are his sort of bread and butter, if you like.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are a bunch of other people. They're sort of vaguely under the umbrella of this group called DRASTIC. But they are the genuine heroes of this story. They found out so much more than I found out, than Alina Chan found out directly, although she did some spectacular work too, or anybody else. And so for me, this is the cult of the amateur a bit. The talented individual. Citizen science is another phrase to use.
Weaponized autism.
Weaponized autism. Thank you. And that, yes, absolutely. I mean, exactly. And most of us haven't got the
Focus.
patience to sit down and go through 10,000 viral serial numbers. So if it hadn't been for them, we wouldn't have been able to make the case we did in the book. And by the way, our book is not a single-handed demand that the lab leak is the only way of thinking about it. Quite the reverse. We wrote a balanced book. We looked into the market data too. And, someone like Gilles Damaneuf, who's gone through the market data in unbelievable detail. And he's a financial analyst living in New Zealand. These are the heroes of the story.
Yeah. But the market data, all of the animals tested in the market were negative for COVID-19, isn't it?
That's the fundamental flaw with this hypothesis, that in every other case, whether it's Nipah or Hendra or MERS or SARS, you find infected animals in the place where the virus first turned up. There were no infected animals in the market. Maybe they missed them, but still, even if that was the case, there were no infected animals in the market. And everything they say now about, oh, well, raccoon dogs were in the market. Yeah, but they weren't infected. Well, there is one sample where there's raccoon dog DNA and virus RNA in the same sample. Yeah, but there's about 1,000 human samples where there's RNA in the sample. And actually, in that sample you're talking about, there's 200 million reads, and only one of them is the virus.
Mm.
No, that's not a
Yeah.
very dense sample.
Yeah, so this wouldn't have been possible without your internet sleuth.
It
People
wouldn't
like
have
to
been
put,
possible without Twitter either, because Twitter
yes.
was the medium where these guys communicated with each other and with people like me.
Mm-hmm.
And so and Twitter was a little bit beastly to lab leakers at times before Musk took over, but not nearly as bad as Facebook. And it never stopped me or the seeker putting up a tweet saying, here's an interesting piece of data that seems to point to the lab.
Okay.
Now, they may have downplayed tweets like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Probably
shadow
did.
banned or.
Right, they shadow banned
But as
stuff.
long as you too see it, as long as the people who should see it, then it doesn't matter, does it?
Well, yeah, exactly. It may have not spread as efficiently as
Yeah, it didn't have a
in
human cleavage
viral.
side.
It didn't have a cleavage. Thank you. Oh, well, this has been
I
great
was
to
just
have.
going to ask you one more question though, but what, just because of that free speech thing, did you see Hillary Clinton explicitly say that she wants power over the internet, over platforms like X? And she literally said, because
She
she
said
literally
she used
used
the
the
word
word
we in
power.
an interesting way, didn't she? She said something about we've lost power over
Yes.
the word. The interesting question in that, the interesting word in that sentence is we.
Yeah.
If she means we, the human race, have lost power over these things, I don't agree. If she
No.
means we, the self-selecting elite, have lost power over these organizations, yes, absolutely, and thank God you have.
Yeah. So long live free speech and
And
X.
what you or Donald Trump or anyone else having power over what I can say.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, right then. So yeah, it's been a pleasure. Nice to see you again.
Great to see you again, and keep well, and see you about.
Bye bye.
Good luck, Paula.
Cheers.
Thank you.